So we have Mark Dick, who is a Green Christian member from Ballymena, and he's also a GP in Northern Ireland. And we have Tony Emerson, who's one of the founder members of Joy in Enough, a retired college lecturer living in London for the last 50 years. Tony is going to pose many of the questions. Mark is going to respond, and then Tony may have some responses to that. And we hope that at the end we might have time for questions from the audience as well. I'll keep an eye on the chat for that. So rather than putting your hands up, if you can pop those in the chat or just say me please, I'll know to go to you at the end if we have the time. If I may, I'm going to top and tail us with prayers depending on time, but I'm going to top us with a slightly stroppy one. And then if we have the time at the end, I will round us off with a prayer that is perhaps more lovingly minded. This prayer is entitled A Prayer About Frustrations with Politicians. It has a longer title, which is a desperate prayer for patience with politicians who have excellent suits and shoes, meticulous hair, and gobs of television makeup, who have utterly forgotten that their jobs are finally about feeding and clothing and protecting and schooling children. And the prayer is this: they are driving me stark, muttering, bubbling insane. They are nattering and preening. They are dissembling and speechifying. They are evading the question and mouthing empty slogans. They are attacking straw men of their own devising and calculating market share. Their words are wind and dust, and meanwhile children starve and are raped and have no beds and teachers and doctors. They say they will do things, and they do not do those things. They appeal to the worst in us so as to be able to make money. They send children to war, though they have never, many of them, been in war themselves and do not know the savagery of what they're sending children to do. They abuse their power and sneer at the poor and condescend to the elderly and lie about their motivations and their biographies. They would happily soil every lake and river and pond and creek and rivulet with every imaginable searing, death-dealing chemical if there was enough money in it for them. They would foul every square metre of air with choking smoke and ash if there was enough money in it for them. They do not care about our children and our children's children. They pose for photo opportunities on the way to church, but they do not feed the hungry and clothe the naked and house the homeless and slake the thirst of those who are desperate. Dear sweet Lord, give me the patience to be reasonable and call them calmly to account. Give them the startle of guilt and the ripple of shame. Make sore their consciences and shiver their arrogance, so that they may puncture it themselves and so begin to achieve humility and be of actual, honest, genuine service to the least among us. This we pray, trying hard not to snarl over much. And so, Amen. And that is written by Brian Doyle in a book of uncommon prayer. And now I'm going to hand over to Tony. I think you're going to ask the first question, and you and Mark will back and forth for a little while.
Thank you, Kat. The first question is simple. Mark, can you outline how democracy has evolved through the ages?
Yes, Tony. First of all, I just want to start with a disclaimer. I'm not an expert in global governance, but I want, just like Kate Raworth and Greta Thunberg, who are wonderful advocates for degrowth and climate justice, I want to speak tonight about global democracy with ideas from Andreas Bummel and Dina Freeman, who've done a lot of work in this area, and particularly on a world parliament. And as I said, I'm not an expert, but I've just finished reading a small book by John Keane. It's called The Shortest History of Democracy. And he's a professor of politics at the University of Sydney. And he sets democracy out into 4 different parts. Firstly, assembly democracy, basically ancient Athens, based on the spoken word, and small-scale democracy of city-states. The second stage is electoral democracy from probably about 1776 to 1945, based on the written word and based on a gradual increase on the franchise. And then what he calls monetary democracy, not monetary democracy from after 1945, where there's greater scrutiny, and certainly nowadays much greater scrutiny with the digital mass communication we now have. But tonight we really want to discuss the future, which is when I want to put the case for global democracy in the future, especially a world parliament, elections, and more monitoring and citizen engagement. So that was setting the scene, Tony.
Thank you, Mark. Well, in addition to what you have said, I like the principle of subsidiarity. It's espoused by the European Union and also believed by the Catholic Church. Quote from one EU document. The subsidiarity principle is to ensure that powers are exercised, if you may recall, as close to the citizen as possible in accordance with the proximity principle. In simple language, some issues are best decided at a very local level, some at national, some at international level, and at all sorts of intermediate levels, village, county, regional province, continent, global. The principle is more an aspiration than a reality, yet I think it's something we Green Christians should support. It's particularly relevant to climate and global environmental problems, as I'll come to later. So now that was the first question. The second question, again for you, Mark, what are the political obstacles that need to be overcome?
Well, we could ask who governs the world and how. Global government currently is really rather messy and complicated. It can be divided into state-centered governance, multi-stakeholder governance, and then private governance. Firstly, international organizations like the United Nations are not fully democratic, with one state, one vote, with no population weighting. The World Bank and the IMF are more $1, one vote. The US holds a veto and operates unfair loan conditionalities on poorer nations. Things like the G7 and the G20 are clubs of government. They're also undemocratic and operate behind closed doors. And even more secretive are transnational governmental networks such as the Financial Stability Board and the International Competition Network. I'd never heard of them before, but apparently they're quite important. Well, that's not quite true. I was reading a book this afternoon by Mark Carney, and he tells me what the FSB is. It was set up after the financial crash in 2007 to improve financial governance. But again, it's not really democratic. Secondly, there are multi-stakeholder governance. These include government officials, NGOs, and transnational business organizations. But who elected them and who do they represent? It's shareholder and corporate rule, really. Multi-stakeholder networks, you could say, dealt quite badly with COVID through the COVAX system and the way vaccines were shared internationally or not shared. And thirdly, and maybe worst of all, is private governance. It's the most democratic, or undemocratic rather, of all. There's no regulation of the banking system through SWIFT or democratic control of the internet domain access in ICANN. And the one that really annoys me most is the investor state dispute system, which allows big corporations to take the governments of the global south to court for limiting access to their natural resources. This really demonstrates how undemocratic the world is. Corporate courts and private tribunals seem to be necessary to enforce global business for the elite, but global human rights law has no such governance. It'd be far better to have a global democracy overseeing all governance. Just want to take a second to talk about federation and confederation. A federation is a political unit with subsidiarity, as Tony mentioned, of devolving power to regions, i.e. multi-level governance. There's often two chambers. In the USA, for instance, one chamber represents the states and regions, and then one represents the individual citizens. A confederation, on the other hand, is a union of equal sovereign states. And I suppose the EU would be sort of a hybrid model. Worldwide, there are about 30 countries, mostly the larger ones, that are federations covering 40% of the world population, because federations are excellent for large, complex societies, giving equal access to all citizens. Unfortunately, the UN is a weak confederation of sovereign states with no representation for individuals. World Federation could improve global governance and world politics by transferring power both up and down to aid redistribution and tackling climate change. So that's what I would differentiate between those two, Tony.
I think, Mark, you're referring you're still referring to what you ideally would like to see happening, but my emphasis is more on the political obstacles to bringing that about. Most obviously, the unwillingness of individual states to give up their powers. Can you visualize at the moment, practically, the USA, Russia, China, etc., in the UK government, again saying, giving up the powers to a royal body, giving up the powers they have? How do we bring that about? That's the biggest obstacle I see. Perhaps less obviously the corporate lobbying groups who know how to get their way with existing national governments and other bodies, but would be anxious about a new, very powerful global governing body. Well, at a more personal level, would we all as human beings be happy to be governed by global government located, say, in New York or Singapore or wherever, rather than one in London, Belfast, or Edinburgh? I just leave them as questions.
For a tiny bit of context before we move on, I'll just mention that I come from the tax justice arena before I emerged here, and in our arena, global tax is a big issue. Poorer countries not being able to retain sufficient tax on the exploitation of their people and their resources that goes on when multinationals shift their profit bases to offshore islands like the Isle of Man. And there has been great rejoicing recently in that a movement has been passed that should allow global tax agreements to pass from under the auspices of the OECD, so bigger countries with bigger voices, to the UN, where the perception is, at least, whether it's true or not, that smaller countries with smaller voices will get to have their say. So I understand your concerns, Mark, about whether the UN has enough voice, but there are perhaps roles that it can play to be helpful in some of these areas. And Tony, I'll pass back to you for the next question, if I may.
So, thank you, Kat. Question 3: why have we not stopped the global climate destabilizing already? Why have we not had effective action on climate change?
Well, because climate agreements like the Kyoto Protocol do not really work. A federal democratic government would bring about reduction of fossil fuels, develop green alternatives, and make real climate justice happen much better. So far, international institutions in our current system have been dangerously ineffective in the face of the scale of the global climate crisis. The harm producers of the global north, causing such catastrophic negative externalities, need to be brought under a global justice system. The current international COP events that we've been following recently allow nation-state polluters to set unambitious emission targets or simply withdraw from agreements. Naming and shaming is not enough. Sitting above all national parliaments, there should be a world parliament. Basically, no emissions without permissions. 30 years have been wasted. Voluntary reduction in fossil fuels by some has reduced demand globally, led to cheaper fuel and then more use and pollution by others. The oil reserves are huge and potentially worth a lot of money, leading to a prisoner's dilemma for fossil fuel companies to cash in and literally or metaphorically build fortresses on higher ground to avoid rising sea levels. Maybe worth in this context reading either The Wall by John Lanchester or this book here, The Nomad Century by Gia Vince. She's coming along to our book club next week to talk to us about her dystopian future. Clean renewable energies have rapidly come down in price, but fossil fuels still supply 85% of the world's energy needs. And at the current rate, it'll be 20 to 25 years to replace them completely. And of course, the fossil fuel giants have such power that they're able to buy political favor and slow down change. Those who want to delay change argue that carbon taxes harm the poor most, and the global north, whose prosperity has been built on coal and oil, does not have the right to deny the industrial revolution benefits to others. But a global democratic system of loss and damage would become real with a world parliament, a global tax system, global law and justice, and that would ensure proper reparations because the majority would demand it. So I think those are worth thinking about, Tony.
Mark, I don't disagree with anything you said there, but I want to widen the scope of this discussion in one sense. Excuse me. Barry Goodwin, who is formerly environmental officer for Southwark Anglican Diocese, presented us with great model for climate action. The political, I'm sorry, I'm not very good at diagrams. The political at top level, the parochial or local, or the personal and household. And for me, this illustrates the subsidiarity principle applied to climate. The various corporate agreements need to have teeth, as you said, Mark. So if a national government doesn't keep up to their limits and agreements, there should be sanctions imposed by them by a global body. We need some sort of global governing body, but with authority over certain areas of activity only. Climate change is one. Security and peace between nations is another. Russia needed to know there would be severe consequences for marching its troops into Ukraine, and China needs to know that they cannot invade Taiwan. But the power of nations needs to be engaged as well. Some of our very elderly members and some of your patients, Mark, I'm sure, will remember Dig for Victory, the willingly compliance with quite severe rationing, and the many other ways that nationalist fervour was engaged in World War II. Indeed, was this nationalist fervour not also engaged as well in the COVID pandemic? Our great pride in the UK about the rollout of the COVID vaccination and the popular anger over Partygate. Anatole Levin says in Climate Change in the Nation State, we need to engage this national fervour on climate. A future Keir Starmer government might be a world leader in the struggle to achieve net zero. And Mark, I can hardly be accused of being a little Englander, how can you, as I proudly maintain my Irish passport and think, Mark, but you and I will be glued to TV screens watching Men in Green in the final week of the Six Nations on Saturday. Sorry for that perversion. As to the parochial level, it's important. People working together to set up renewable energy enterprises, housing renovation or innovation schemes, local repair, maintenance, renovation projects, and of course food growing. As Marx says, community action usually involves some conflict, but people can work through their conflicts, and the pride in what they're doing and the mutual support creates a powerful, energizing force. The three local bricks here in South London, Brixton Energy Solar Enterprises, got our local MPs involved, adding to the pressure on government. While action at personal level is also important, if only to appear like if only to avoid appearing like the temperance preacher caught swinging out of the sixth class. Action at these three levels reinforces each other. So, in answer to the question said about why climate has not been stabilized already, action at all three levels so far has been limited, piecemeal, and inadequate.
Do you want to come back on any of that, Mark, or shall we move on to the next question?
I'll pick up some of the other questions. That's okay.
Okay. Over to you, Tony.
So question 4, Mark, why have poverty and inequality soared since the 1980s?
Well, in the current international system, it is impossible to close tax havens, stop transfer mispricing, and to tax corporations properly. International development and the SDGs don't reduce poverty quickly enough. A global democratic government would bring more justice and equity. And I use the word equity there rather than equality. I'll come back to that. Today, half the world's population live on less than $5.50 a day, and just 26 of the world's richest individuals own more than 50% of humanity's combined wealth. That's 3.3 billion adults. The problem is that the economy today operates at a global level, whereas the political regulation operates at a national level. Currently, there is no democratic method to change the system. When most countries' tax systems were set up to aid redistribution in the period of the 1930s to the 1960s, cross-border economic activity was relatively low. Tax systems have not been able to adapt to globalization post-1980, and corporate tax rates have become a race to the bottom, reducing government coffers for redistribution everywhere. 2/3 of world trade is carried out by about 100,000 transnational corporations. These are networks of separate yet connected units within each country of operation. Transfer mispricing is a method that these units use to interact with their business inside the transnational corporation to avoid tax. Governments lose billions to tax havens this way. Global democracy could solve this scandal by treating these businesses as global corporations and applying a common rate of corporation tax, i.e. ending tax havens, and having a global tax body to regulate at the same scale, and thereby raise finance to tackle the global problems with lots of redistribution and reparations. Thomas Piketty, the French economist, wants to go further with new taxes. He wants a global wealth tax on the top 1%, which he thinks would raise about $1.5 trillion annually, enough to implement all the sustainable development goals right up to 2030. And he wants a global financial transaction tax of maybe 1%, which could raise $500 billion and put a brake on pointless speed trading on financial markets. A global tax on extraction of natural resources of maybe 1% would raise $300 billion. All these things will change the environment. Natural taxation and distribution is currently not reducing poverty and inequality quickly enough. Overseas aid development is not working either, because as the global south returns far more in debt repayments to the banks of the global north than all the ODA put together. Each country or government has their own goals for poverty alleviation, so the SDGs are fundamentally international and not global. The international politics of social justice is a fake. No serious discussion about tax coordination, sovereign debt, or international trade takes place even at high-level political forums on sustainable development. International development has really just become a smokescreen for tackling poverty and inequality. In reality, nothing concrete is really being done. Instead, we need a layer of global federal democracy, a world parliament, global law, global tax body, and perhaps a global currency and a global central bank would not be bad ideas either. So there's a lot there, Tony, for introducing system change, and I think that needs to be considered.
I'm going to dive in before Tony gets a word in edgewise, simply because I come from the tax justice
that was definitely your question.
arena, but I'm sure Tony will be able to put me right on a few things. But I will say that for us in that arena, going back to, I think it was the year before last, we had the G20 meeting in Italy, talking about how the Biden tax and how global tax protocols could be adjusted so that those countries that were being most exploited for their resources and for their people and so forth could keep some of the tax that they were entitled to, rather than it being shipped off to places like where I live in the Isle of Man. So profit shifting would cease and they would be allowed to keep more. The Biden tax ended up with something that was actually no better than those poor countries, most of them poorer countries had, and in some cases worse, and ended up in a much better tax take for, what a surprise, developed nations like the US and the UK. And then 2 weeks later, many of those same people were in Glasgow for COP26, talking about how they might give some of those same developing countries money in terms of grants and loans that had to be repaid but had strings attached. And so for me, that felt like another form of colonialism. But I need to shut up and hand over to Tony now.
Well, I certainly don't agree. I don't disagree with anything that Mark or you, Kath, have said at this level of global inequality. I do point out that there are more local and national contributory factors as well. Most workforces are now less unionized than they were 40 or 50 years ago, and therefore have little or no collective bargaining power. This particularly applies to people working in less skilled occupations and in the gig economy. Voting in albeit imperfect democracies like ours are poorer people less likely to vote now than they were 40 or 50 years ago? I think so. So the main political parties respond more to the wants of the older, richer voters, less to younger and poorer people. So the political discourse is more about the tax burden and about welfare scroungers and less about inequality. While housing, we have mentioned before, housing is a major cause and consequence related to growing inequality. In this part of the world, at least, certainly in the south of England, poorer people find it nearly impossible to get on the housing ladder, while people with good houses in the right places have found their assets going up in value much faster than the rate of inflation. People in the rental sector are often very badly exploited. I think this is something that's in line with the Piketty argument, which I think Mark has mentioned. Thank you. So that's the fourth question. Now on to the fifth question. What do we mean by think global, act local? How should political power be distributed between entities at different levels?
Well, you mentioned it earlier, Tony. Subsidiarity is the key. Devolving power to the level most appropriate. A wealth tax would be a global decision. River pollution standards would be set nationally. City public transport policy would be agreed locally. So I think I want to push that subsidiarity idea a lot, because it responds to the attacks on this idea of a world parliament that would come from the likes of Anatol Lieven. He's written a book, Climate Change and the Nation State. It was, in my view, disappointingly Western centered for someone who's worked in Russia and Pakistan. And I think certain things can be tackled by the nation state, but there are global problems that we know about that are too big for that. The anti-globalization movement and the World Social Forum believe that another world is possible, and they wanted the globalization from below. But eco villages and cooperatives are not enough, and the movement has fizzled out somewhat. Right-wing populists want de-globalization, but with racist and nationalism undertones that will only lead to more conflict. Democratic globalization is the best option for combating climate change and other global problems. Details, yes, do need to be worked out. We maybe need a global ministry for the environment. As I said, we do need a global tax body. We need global, not international law. And we, the people's campaigns, are urgently needed for global democracy, online voting, and spreading power more equally. And that's where I think all of us come in. I mean, to summarize, a democratic federal world government is needed to stop climate change, reduce inequality, and ensure human rights. Small-scale solutions like eco-villages and transition towns may seem attractive, and there's nothing wrong with that and with indigenous style living either. But one must remember that if we use clothes, computers, electricity, we're still part of the world system. And really caring about social justice means system change at a global level. All the world's people must have a say in how the world systems are arranged. In the end, globalism must trump localism. Now, that's maybe a bit hard. I maybe read back on that a wee bit because I think Tony's got different views on that.
Yeah, well, it's no harm at all for us to have different views, Mark. But it's just the phrasing it as globalism must trump localism, because I think they're all complementary.
Okay.
And the global level is obviously vitally important, but it's different, not more important than the other levels. I strongly believe that we all have obligations to our families, our communities, our countries, as well as to our planet and to the world community. Different obligations apply at different levels. For instance, like paying our taxes at the national level. So I think our disagreement may be more apparent than real on this one. At this level. If you're happy to move on, I go on to question number 5. Why can't the Universal Declaration, the international treaties, the UN agencies, and even the ICC, which is provide us with real human rights?
Well, Tony and I both agree that all people have human rights, entitlements granted from society. Global rights require global enforcement, but the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 was not a binding treaty. It was aspirational only. And an international criminal court was initially opposed by the US, Russia, and China. And instead, international human rights law was introduced through 9 treaties. But signing and ratifying was optional, and there was no enforcement mechanism. Eventually, an international criminal court was set up at The Hague in 1998 to hold individuals accountable, but it was not recognized by many countries. To have a proper global human rights system, humanity needs a democratic global federation, in my view. That might be something that Tony will agree with.
It is very basically, yes. But it needs to be reinforced that sort of people and local organizations need to willingly recognize and comply with the rights of all their fellow citizens. Legislation from world governing bodies in faraway places, New York, Geneva, Singapore, wherever, on its own, isn't going to result in effective action. What is the role of national and local government in this area? These are just questions, and I haven't any expertise in this area. Okay, we move on to question number 6. What are the causes of the huge numbers of migrants and refugees today?
Well, this is topical with the Home Secretary versus Gary Lineker. Why did the USA build a wall, and why is there Fortress Europe? Wouldn't it be better to have a world without borders? For that, we need a democratic federal world government. Huge suffering is caused by poverty and awful living conditions in many parts of the world, and they're not being addressed properly. No wonder so many will risk everything to make it to the land of plenty. In 1950, the UNHCR initiated a refugee convention that incorporated the International Organization for Migration, but the definition of refugees and economic migrants remains problematic, and is left to individual nation states to police, leading to transitory camps and desperate people who are left in legal limbo while the rich can travel freely. I can take my passport and fly wherever I want. The UNHCR is usually just offering humanitarian assistance only. And even after the global compact on migration, governments around the world resist an asylum system set to a global level and opt instead for unsatisfactory status quo while pretending to take action. Reference the UK government currently. Only a democratic global federation recognizing world citizens, each with a world passport, will have the ability to address the underlying drivers that lead to mass migration. And I refer again to the nomad century, which really sets out in stark terms what's going to happen when the equatorial regions become too hot to sustain life. There'll be 1 billion people with two choices. They either stay and perish or they move, and most of them are going to move north. So that, Tony, is something that we're going to have to face, and our children and grandchildren are going to have to face even more in the near future.
My disagreement is how. It is how this problem, and I certainly accept what you say with climate change. There's going to be mass migration from the poorer, warmer world in the equatorial areas by and large. And when you say only a democratic global federation recognizing world citizens with a world passport will have the will to address the underlying drivers of inequality that lead to this mass migration. When you said the only the world body, a reformed and strengthened United Nations needs to set the framework, I agree, but national, regional, and local government have major roles to play, accepting and integrating the newcomers into their societies. Migration is very seldom an easy experience, not just for the migrants, but the communities accepting them and the communities living them. And, originally, I was a migrant coming to London from the far west of Ireland, as my accent might indicate to you. And now, village schools, churches, shops, and pubs are closing in the west of Ireland, like many other rural areas all over the world and all over these islands. Cultural difference, often including language difficulties, have to be overcome in areas of immigration. This requires a lot of resources, which may mean special taxes. People have to be willing to pay the taxes. Local residents and migrants need to learn to live with each other. We need strong national and local governments committed to this work. They must not be let off the hook by saying it's all down to lack of global governing body. Action has to take place at the local and national level as well as the global level. And I think we're on to the last question here before we throw it open to everybody. Surely World Federation is impossible. It is too risky and too utopian. Surely World Federation is too risky, too utopian. Mark.
Right, well, this is the part that everybody's been waiting for. Are 200 legally separate governments all in competition really better than a world federation? Let's look at 4 common myths. Firstly, it's claimed that people are tribal and the whole of humanity is too large to relate to. But multiple complex allegiances prevail in many walks of life. People easily develop a shared identity and interest in our planetary home. If nation states can operate taxation, rule of law, and democracy, a global federalist union could do the same. Secondly, it is said that much of the world's population do not value democracy. But how do we know? And it is much of the consumption from democratic states which undemocratically intervenes and funds and supports oligarchy elsewhere. The global democratic system and a global welfare state would be valued everywhere if funded by global taxes. Global democracy, a government of humanity, by humanity, and for humanity, basically the full democratic circle, is the alternative to the existing system of political injustice. Thirdly, democracy only works on a small scale, people say. But not all small communities are harmonious, and there is no empirical correlation between size and democracy. Balance can be struck between decentralization and centralization of power. There's always room for diversity, and it can be an advantage. Coalitions are needed and useful. A federation on the scale of the whole world would mean that no one group dominates. In a global democracy, politicians will need to find out the issues that voters care about. The system of electing representatives to work for you operates so well in the corporate world at a global level that multinationals have swept all before them. So why would it not work equally well in the political sphere also? And fourthly and finally, a world federation would become a dangerous, tyrannical dystopia, people say. But our present situation is analogous to Athenian Greece. From the wider perspective of women or landless peasants or slaves or people in occupied lands with no vote, Athens was one big oligarchy, the rule of the few. The world is set up today with democracy and freedom and riches for the few, but the oligarchy of oppression and poverty is the experience of many. Corporations are afraid that in a world federation, there will be no longer anywhere for them to hide away their profits. It's time for them to pay their share. We can easily divide government horizontally between the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. And we can divide them further vertically between central levels and regional and local levels. But the division of state power into 200 states, that is one type of division that is not helpful for the 99%. Imagine how much more we could achieve together if our government system was global, as well as national, as well as regional, and as well as local. Please, I implore you to help me in debunking these myths and give a world parliament some consideration. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. You're really providing an inspiration for us to think beyond, think outside the box about the issues facing the world today, which we as Christians are obliged to think about. But I'm just raising the caution, and the question is it particularly is it too utopian? The UK experience of Brexit, of rejecting the European Union, should be a warning, albeit by a slim majority in a referendum of both dubious quality and dubious validity. It seems that a lot of people felt that they were being ruled by people who were very remote from them. It's also interesting to look at who the Leave voters were, mainly older and more working class people. But somewhere people, according to David Coulthard, the writer, as against the anywhere people, the people who identify with their localities when once voted Leave, wasn't seeing themselves as citizens of the world. So it would be a major political battle to bring about the spirit of globalisation and the spirit of the implementation of it. That without even addressing the problems of getting national governments, especially countries like, as I mentioned before, Russia, the USA, China, getting them to give up their powers, or give up some of their powers in areas like global climate and global security. So the question is, how much of our resources in being Christians should we devote to pursuing this aim? Thank you, Mark. You have raised issues which most of us wouldn't have considered otherwise. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Tony. That's a really good place to begin to invite in our audience's questions. And one of the very early ones that I think is really relevant, because we're talking about geographic representation, but there's also timeless representation. Peter Grimwood asks, at my age, should I have a vote at all, or should younger people have 5 votes? This is this long-termism debate, I think, which sometimes becomes quite horrible and sometimes is very instructive. I'm going to pass over to you, Mark, first.
Well, I would say that'd be quite difficult to divide up and decide where you would make a cutoff. I think one person, one vote is probably the simplest way to go, and we can tap into to Peter's wisdom from all his years and justify his vote on that basis, and that would apply to the older generations. So I think if we can get from my one nation, one vote, or $1, one vote, to just one person, one vote, that would be the first step I would be asking for, and that would be true global democracy better than we have it at the minute.
The problem is that I have less at stake because of my life expectancy than someone who is, say, 16 or 15 years old. And because they have a greater stake in the future, a future which is under threat, should they not have more votes than me? We had a Green Christian meeting about this some years ago in which some of these points were raised. And I can remember saying what I've just intimated now. My view didn't go down very well. But I stick with it nonetheless.
You could use your vote partly on behalf of your grandchildren or grandnieces and grandnephews and sort of help them to make a better future by voting well.
Well, I could, of course I could do that, but I'm well aware that people of my generation are less sympathetic to green causes than younger people are, for very good reasons.
But is that a persuasion battle that we are all here engaged in and have to knuckle down and continue to work at?
Tony, is that a point at which you'd have anything you want to chip in on?
Well, I say, rather than depriving us oldies of the vote, like Peter and I think it would be much better to have strong marketing campaigns to get younger people to vote, to get younger people active in politics, so that the political parties and the agencies of corporate government, as well as national governments, have to respond more to the interests of young people.
I would say one other thing, Kat. It's very easy for us again to slip into global north blinkers and forget that the global south has a much younger age profile population, and their vote would be useful to mobilize in a world parliament, and that would balance things out. So we mustn't always fall the mistake that Lieven makes and think of things from a Western-centric point of view. We have to, when we're talking about global issues, global democracy, a world parliament, we have to think from a global perspective ourselves and put ourselves in Lagos in Nigeria or Lilongwe in Malawi, and think from their point of view as well as just our own, because that's what the whole thing I'm trying to promote here is, a global family.
Yeah, I understand that. One of the projects that we've had going on within Deep Adaptation is surfacing those invisibilized voices, the people who are actually on the front line, showing us what it's like for them, suffering for the lifestyles that we're fortunate enough to enjoy. And I can see that Peter's mentioned in the chat George Marshall's book. He's a great speaker, by the way, if you ever get to hear him. Don't even think about it. Explaining that that blind spot that we sometimes cultivate in our minds because it's more comfortable to do so, around why we don't need to change the way we live our lives. Catherine, I see, has mentioned sociocracy, and Catherine, do you want to speak to that?
So, my experience of this is within some co-housing groups where decision making isn't about immediate consensus. It's about active listening, and where there is opposition to a goal, that is listened to, and then a solution found that addresses the opposition and then moves further into a goal. So small groups are tasked with reaching agreement for goals, and then they feed into the larger group until all the goals have contributed to the greater decision making. So it isn't about one vote, one member. It's about active listening and problem solving and valuing the individual's voice.
That sounds to me to be hugely valuable, because not everybody has the articulacy to express their thoughts or the access to the mechanisms we've currently got for registering a vote. Mark and Tony, I'll go to Tony first this time, just for a change. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sorry, no, not all. Turn over to Mark.
I would be a big fan of active listening, and I think I can adapt that in. The point about a world parliament would be that your delegate is directly elected by you, not via your government, and they would have to listen to your concerns, and you can then get decision making and be involved in that. And I wonder whether new technology now will allow the whole world population to be involved in that for the first time ever in history, because I mean, even some of the poorest people in Kenya do their banking now on a mobile phone, and they've got connectivity that we've never had before. So it goes back to the point that democracy used to be by word of mouth, and then it was the written word, and then it's been the communications have evolved. And I think we would expect the parliamentary representatives in the World Parliament to be listening to their voters, and better decision making, I think, would result, even though it seems at a huge scale to what we're used to. I don't think that is impossible. I would be optimistic for that for the future.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And I think also sociocracy is about decision making at the grassroots, and then governance enacting that. So
that was it.
Yeah, ensuring that decisions are made by groups through consent rather than consensus. So consent means not disagreeing, as opposed to all voting for one thing. And then once that's agreed, the governance would be about enacting it.
Mechanically, it still sounds difficult, but it's difficult now. So
yeah.
So we might have to trust one another to manage what's going on in our own.
Absolutely. So it's starting in cooperatives, and it started in Quaker groups, in fact, and actually to make it happen in a larger global context is actually the question. So that was my question.
Yeah.
I think this is a very important issue Catherine has raised. It's very, very important. And sorry, I'm moving away from the screen again. And it's one of the great difficulties I find with the whole electronic communication era. You're in person-to-person communication, you get lots of different signals from your fellow members. You get their eye contact, their body language, and so on, which that is very, even on Zoom, it's very hard to pick up this body language and all these other modes of communication we have as we speak, or as we confer with each other. Now,
Tony, don't you think that's also a weakness, though, of that kind of interaction, in that a charismatic individual can persuade someone to vote for them when they have really hostile policies?
Yeah, well, that's where I believe that it has to be. I don't believe in leaderless groups. I believe a leader. The group has to be facilitated by a skilled facilitator who ensures everybody everybody's voice is heard and nobody dominates. I think that's important. It's terribly important. Now, how you can expand to wider areas than just the 10 or 20 or even maximum maybe about 30 people meeting in a face-to-face group. I don't know, but I think it's one of the great challenges of time. And how can electronic communication be used to facilitate good interpersonal communication? So the questions are raised, I don't know the answers.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm smiling at a comment from Peter Grimwood. Is the nearest thing that we have to a green-oriented world entity the Catholic Church? I realise this thought might not go well down in Ballymena. Do we feel that different denominations perhaps have a different perspective on how global justice is recognised and then administered? I wonder. And I'm going to hand that to you first, Peter. Actually, I think you need to stand up and be counted.
Agreed.
Well,
it's a good question.
Clearly, the Catholic Church, so far as papal pronouncements are concerned, is very much on the right page from our point of view, so far as the environmental crisis is concerned. So you could argue that this is an example of benevolent autocracy. And it may be that the right policy for green Christians such as ourselves is twofold. One, to try and convert the autocrats, which in the case of Pope Francis, we seem to have succeeded in doing. And the other is to promote the witnessing. That should be our key aim. And that, of course, is exactly what we do through the Way of Life group. And it's also what particular individuals within Green Christian do, people like Ruth Jarman, Sue Parfitt, and others who we could mention. So, you know, this, as it were, isn't democracy. It sort of transcends democracy, but it could lead to a change in the opinion of the demos. The difficulty we have is the time perspective. We need urgent action on this. And that's why I hesitate to endorse these ideas about democratic governance. I really do think we need to try and convert the autocrats in the cause of theocracy, basically.
Yeah, I wouldn't really disagree with that. The only thing I would expand it slightly and say I would welcome anybody on the call's ideas on how we can improve the democracy that we do have in the United Kingdom, because it'd be much easier for us to promote global democracy,
well, of course,
better democracy here.
The Pope is quite anxious through his synodality program to increase democracy within the Catholic Church, because it's encountering considerable opposition to this idea from the, you know, second-rank autocrats, particularly those in the United States, who don't like this at all.
But there must be something wrong if we consider that. Let's take the United Kingdom just again for an example. If 10% of the population have all the wealth and power, and the other 90% are struggling.
Oh yes.
How has our democracy got us in the position that we're in, where we are making decisions that lead to cost of living crisis and turning away migrants and all the other things that don't seem to be fair and just? If you think about the rule of the majority, if it's in the advantage or the benefit for 90% of the population to do things completely differently, why are we not doing things completely differently? How come our system has allowed the 10%, of which probably most of us here on the call are in that group, retaining all the wealth and power and maintaining the status quo that is not fair and just? I can't get my head around that, and there must be something else we have to do to try and get system change.
Mark, I'm wondering if I can throw a little hand grenade into the discussion here and say, even within our own country, we cannot get the poorest to have their voices heard.
Yes,
over and above those of the wealth.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Our democracy is not very good.
So we're on the same page. So on the one hand, what you're saying sounds like a solution, but the difficult bit is, how do you bring about that solution? And that is, how do you get people who have lots and don't want to give it up to give it up? And I recognize we're not looking for every answer here, but I'm wondering if that's.
Well, does that challenge our current first past the post electoral system?
No. Having said that, I don't know whether Christianity and our belief that we should be caring for the poorest counts for a lot of the world's population, but not all of it. Most faiths seem to share similar values, but secularism seems to be a tide in the other direction. Sorry, that was a bit of a non sequitur. So we have another question from Stephen Ball. For so long, world and global discussions have had a Western/global North perspective. How would you take into account that many countries have a different perspective on what is acceptable to do in the global South? And actually, that feels as though it resonates with what I was trying, but not as well as Stephen has said it, to say. We have a very Christian approach that we should be caring for the poorest and the weakest and making reparations for the wealth that we've gained. But not everybody thinks like us. Is it possible to bring the world with us?
I think you'll find that there would be a lot of support for Matthew 22:34 and after the great commandments, loving God and loving neighbor. Certainly the loving neighbor bit could bring a lot of people with you. And that plays into how do you wrestle the power away from the Security Council, for instance, on the United Nations, where 5 countries have carved everything up for the benefit of themselves. And I mean, the actual practicalities of getting something off the ground would be probably United Nations Parliamentary Assembly, first of all, where each country would nominate, first of all, 2 delegates, one from their governing party and one from their opposition party, just to get a parliamentary assembly up, and that would then evolve to elections, where you would elect 800 deputies from across the world with constituencies of about 10 million to try and have a chance to hear from the voices that we don't hear from, and the billions of people who really have been just not had a seat at the table up until now, because the Western post-colonial powers have carved everything up to suit themselves. And that's really part of what I'm trying to push at, and the global democracy movement is trying to change. And I think it's something that the Green Christian folk could support, and hence that's why I'm trying to get it on the agenda for Joy and Enough, and particularly the Plenty course. I know the syllabus is jam-packed and it's adding more stuff in, but I think this is important stuff, and we will not solve the global problems unless everybody does have a seat at the table. And that's not the way things are at the moment.
Just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't try and do it.
Exactly.
There's a question here from Colin McCulloch asking if you can throw in a left field comment. Colin, I can't see if you're still here and want to put the question yourself. No, I'm going to throw it in then. In scripture, global governance, such as the Babylonian or Roman empires, are fundamentally ungodly. we could probably say much of the British Empire as well, run by sinful men, even if they sometimes do good acts. The original globe, everybody understanding everyone and working together, was Babel, which God broke up and dispersed humanity into nations. So are we in danger of promoting a humanistic system which will in effect make God and spiritual redemption irrelevant? Is humankind now better educated and less sinful? And where is hope to be found? Wow. Big, beautiful questions.
You can tackle that one first, Tony.
I know, my head hurts. It's too difficult at this time of night to get.
Maybe this is one for just a longer discussion. Maybe this is one we can carry on if we put it on one of our social media groups and people can discuss. But I do think it's very difficult when you have hierarchical systems. And I think what you both aspire to is something that's non-hierarchical, and humankind is innately prone to that frailty.
I mean, all I would say in conclusion is that I liked Peter's challenging thought that was along similar lines to Colin's question about Christians being theocrats and not democrats. But I would maybe say let's try and be a wee bit of both, theocrats for the long term into eternity and beyond. But here and now, let's try and be as much Democrats as we can, on the basis that, as someone famous said, democracy is not a very good system, but it's better than all the others. I think that's probably where we are, and I'll fall back on that as my defense for promoting a more democratic global federalist system. I think we can work at that. It'll not be perfect, obviously, this side of Christ's return, but I think we should be knuckling down and working in that direction.
I have an inkling that at the heart of it is hearts, because you won't get real democracy until the people who have control want real democracy, and that's a change in their hearts. Barbara's said a really important thing, which is real proportional representation, which would help. And that's always going to be difficult when you've got human beings who don't have access to the same voting technology that we have, or the same literacy, or the same access to information. But that's exactly it. I'm going to be cheeky now and say that as it's 10 past, we're getting quite close to the end of our evening. And if I may, unless anyone else has a burning question, wave your hands like mad if you have. Can't see any. I'm going to lead us into a less stroppy prayer to round our evening off than I started with, because I think we've heard so much incentive in favor of giving a voice to the voiceless, remembering what Christ called us to do, which is to share what we have and care for the vulnerable and sometimes call our leaders to account. So this is from the New Zealand prayer book, and it's a blessing for our leaders. And it is this: Eternal God, fount of wisdom, we ask you to bless the nation's leaders that we have elected. Grant that through their discussions and decisions, we may solve our problems effectively, enhance the well-being of our nation and our planet, and achieve together a fairer and more united society. Can't speak, society. And I'd really like to thank our speakers this evening, Mark and Tony, and all those who've put questions forward as well, because this is the heart of what we're all about. And may that heart be manifested in the kingdom to come very soon. Amen.